Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the South won a civil war? Now I know a lot of alternative history videos have already covered this, and actually the entire genre of alternative history began with this very topic. However, the reason I've kind of like stayed away from it is because a lot of it has really been done. Like, it's been done to death. And so I've always been hesitant about doing a video on like what if the South won a civil war, just because of like what could I add that was unique and like original. So this video is going to be unique and original. However, just a disclaimer, if you're into like Civil War battles and like the uniform and this and that, like I can talk about those things, but I'm not doing it in this video. So if you're a real like nerd for Civil War, like kind of like the battles and everything, this is not the video for you. Okay, this video is just going to be focusing on the demographics of the South, it's focusing on the economy of the South, and it's focusing on the Constitution of the South and how this would have affected the United States. So if you're not interested in those kind of things and you're interested in like the more military side of things, go somewhere else. Like kind of, or better yet, if you don't like this video, go and search out the rest of my channel. There must be some video out there for you, so that's what I'd advise. Yeah, that way you stay in circulation for the channel, right? But anyway, so that's what we're going to be looking into in this video. So in order for this timeline to happen, the basic premise is going to be that there is not really a civil war, that the North just kind of allows it and just goes, okay, you win, right? So it's kind of, rather than being a really contentious like divorce as such, it's a more amicable divorce where people go, yeah, well, we can still be friends. Like, yeah, you keep the house and you keep the kids, and yeah, but we'll still like see each other on weekends, right? So as unlikely as this is, this is the massive caveat of this would never happen, because this would never happen. There's no way that the North would have just allowed the South to have just like split off like that. But that's literally the only way that this would happen. The South would not have survived a war. I know that the Southern like generals were really good. I know that the North were really incompetent, etc., etc. I know, but regardless, there's no way that the South wins that war if it goes on for any length of time, because Northern industry, Northern population, everything is just tilted so heavily against the North that eventually they would have been worn down. And then even if they survived that war, going into the future, the North is going to just continue to industrialize, continue to like outpace the South, and it's just going to get to a point, at any point in future, if there's ever a war, the North ends up crushing the South, okay? So the only way that the South survives in this is if the North decides not to fight, okay? So that's the only way that this is going to happen. So that's the premise that we're going with. So first of all, looking at the demographics of the South. So what we find is that the different families there, not all of them own slaves, obviously. So when we're talking about the free people within the South, we're talking predominantly about white people, okay? Yes, there were a lot of freed blacks. Yes, there were a lot of Native Americans there. And also some of those groups did actually own slaves as well. But for the vast majority of it, you're talking overwhelming majority, it was white people who owned slaves, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about here. So when we say the free people doing this, or the free families doing this, that's what we're talking about. For the vast majority of the time, we're talking about white people owning them, right? So the free population of the South, right, 6% of them were slave owners. So that's not that much when you think about it, but when you kind of scale it up to the so-called free families, right, you find that actually 31% of all households in the South own slaves. You wouldn't say that that's an insignificant population. So when people kind of poo-poo it and say, oh, the vast majority of whites in the South didn't own slaves, yes, that's true, but it ignores the fact that it was still an integral part of their system, which is what we're going to get into a little bit later. And of the population of the South, 39% of them were slaves, right? So, and obviously this changes from one state to the next, right? So in particular, in the Deep South, we look at these figures, in the South as a whole, it ends up being 6%, 31% and 39%. But when we translate this to the Deep South, we find that 7% of the free population owned slaves, 38% of the households owned slaves, and the slave population made up 48% of the total population, right? And this, in particular in certain states, it's even more so. So in South Carolina, 9% of whites owned slaves, 46% of all households had slaves, and slave population in South Carolina was 57%. And again, you see a similar picture within the state of Mississippi, where 9% of people own slaves, 49% of households own slaves, and the slave population is 55% of the total state population. So when we kind of get this idea that like there were obviously some states, and obviously I'll have it on screen now, like some states didn't have that many people owning slaves, and slaves made up a relatively small part of the population. However, in some states it's heavily concentrated, and this is in the so-called Cotton Belt, which is now the so-called like Black Belt. This is where African Americans make up the majority of people in these counties, and that's as the legacy of slavery even to this day. Now, I can already hear some people in the comments section being like, oh no, it wasn't due to slavery, oh, it wasn't due to slavery, yeah. Okay, that's complete nonsense, and the reason for that is many-fold, right? First of all, a big part of the South's economy was based on slavery, and also a key reason for those who seceded was to preserve the institution of slavery, right? So let's not like dance around this. That was the reason. It says it multiple times in multiple different declarations of independence. That's why they're breaking away. So just to give a little bit of context of just how huge the institution of slavery was, right? 70% of all US exports came from the South, right? And of those exports, 75% was cotton. So you're talking about slightly over half of all US exports before the Civil War came from cotton, which was grown by slaves in the South. So to try and pretend that like this wasn't a huge like institution and that it wasn't like that important, yes it was, right? It was a pivotal part of the South's economy. Now, another big thing that you'll hear from people peddling the so-called lost cause myth is that, oh, it's to do with tariffs, yeah. And actually it is true that like the South was like very anti-protectionist, as we'll get onto a little bit later. They actually wrote it in their constitution that they were going to aim towards like free trade. And one of the first things that they did upon setting up their government was lowering the tariff rates from 20% down to 10%, with the eventual aim of lowering tariffs like almost to zero, yeah, over time. So what was the main reason for this? Well, if you think about it, the North was heavily industrialized, it was heavily urbanized, and so what the North wanted to do was to focus on protecting this industry. So cheaper like kind of manufactured goods coming from Britain and from France and etc. couldn't get into America. So having these high tariffs would like protect their own like industry, and like that way their industry would be able to take off. But the South, which was much more agrarian and obviously focused on cheap like slave labour, didn't want to industrialise. And so for them, their main thing was getting their products, i.e. cotton, tobacco, etc., out to market. So you wouldn't want to have protectionism, you'd want to have as free a trade as possible. That way there's as few barriers as possible to your trade getting to the customers that you actually wanted to. So that's why the North and the South had very different views of what the kind of tariff situation should be. You could say that that was a big division, and it was, but a big reason for that debate in the first place was because of slavery. The debate about slavery is the reason why you're not having this later debate about tariffs. Another big misconception that we have about the South is that there was this kind of like yeehaw, like kind of like land of like freedom and you know, small government and stuff. Actually, what you find is that the Confederate States of America was pretty socialist, yeah, like kind of, you know, by today's standard. It was one of the first countries in the world that nationalized railways and set price controls. It was also using the money-making machine as if it was like Venezuela or something, you know, so as a result, the South ended up experiencing a lot of hyperinflation, and so, you know, a big part of why like the South's economy after the war took so long to recover was because people's savings were completely wiped out and their economy was wiped out by this hyperinflation. And so in many ways, the Confederate States, you know, resembled a kind of like a socialist kind of state, yeah, where it controlled its citizens, even to the point of like what the citizens believed in or where they could travel. So for instance, people in the North could come and go as they pleased, and while Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus for a while in the context of the Civil War, it was still a situation where people in the North were much freer than people in the South. Say nothing, of course, of the African American population in the North versus in the South. The Confederate government cracked down and actually rounded up people who were still loyalist to the Union, and, you know, clamped down on freedom of speech. There was also even like internal passports, so like traveling from one state within the South to the next was very difficult. So in many ways, this Confederate government, rather than being this bastion of liberty, was actually an incredibly repressive, like kind of top-down state, which like had an iron grip on its citizenry. Right, so now that we've got through all the boring stuff like, the demographics and the economy, now we're going to get onto the really interesting stuff, which is constitutions, right? So the Constitution of the South, it's kind of complicated because there's some bits of it where you go, oh, I really like that, and like America should probably adopt that. And then there's other bits were obviously abhorrent, right? So we're going to get through the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Confederate Constitution. So starting off with some of the good things. So in the South, they decided that the president would only serve one term, and it would be a 6-year term. And some people would be like, oh no, that doesn't make sense, etc. But when you think about it, most US presidents, after the first 6 years, people's ratings towards them start to really dip down. Yeah, they're kind of known in the last 2 years as lame duck presidents because no one really likes them. People are a bit fed up with them. They kind of just want them to kind of like go and stuff at that point. And so if you had this 6-year term limit, presidents would come in, be like, right, this is my agenda, I'm planning to do this, that, and then they do it, and then that would be it. There'd be no re-elections, and so in a way it would make government a bit more efficient because people would come in with a clear purpose, and they're not just going to like sit about and like be focused on that whole first term on getting re-elected for the second term, and then by the time they've got the second term, they've lost all their political capital in the first place because people already had 4 years of them. So yeah, so maybe this system, I don't know, like let me know what you think in the comment section, but I think that this system here to me makes more sense. Having a president serving one term like kind of for 6 years makes more sense than them serving 2 terms over 8 years, but that's just me. Also on top of that, they made some other tweaks to the US Constitution. So they mainly kept the Constitution, but they did make some other minor tweaks like this. So one of the main things that they scrapped was the ratification for different constitutional amendments, right? So within the US system, it requires 3/4 of states, and America at the current time has 50 states. So all it takes is 13 of them to gang up and be like, we don't want this bill. And the other 37 states, they don't get a constitutional amendment. And so it's not really that fair. It doesn't really make that much sense. And so what South said is that rather than having this 3/4 threshold, that the threshold would be reduced down to 2/3. So if this was to take place in America, you'd only need to have 34 states rather than 38, which makes it a little bit easier to get across the line. Although it might not seem like a lot, like it would actually like be a significant improvement like to America. America hasn't had a constitutional amendment since 1992, and a big reason for that is because every time people try and propose one, it ends up dying in the long weeds because it's very difficult to get that kind of consensus over 38 states. Another improvement, in my opinion, is the line item veto. So rather than a president having to veto an entire bill that he doesn't like just because there's one little bit, instead he's able to be like, hey, I like 90% of this. However, there's like 1 or 2 little bits here. If I'm putting a veto on that, so change that about, and then like we'll sign through the bill. So in this way, it would be a lot better because a lot more things would be able to get past that, and there'd be a bit more like room for compromise as such. Rather than people have this kind of all or nothing approach to things, it's a bit more nuanced and a bit more balanced, and would foster a bit more cooperation between the executive and the legislature. And it has been something that's been pushed by certain presidents, but it's just never got off the ground yet, mainly because obviously that would take a constitutional amendment to change it, and as we discussed, it takes ages to get it changed, so that's why it's not really been changed. Also, another thing within their constitution was a bit more controversial, but I think this would have had a very, very drastic effect on America, right? And that is that it would require 2/3 of people in both houses to support any kind of spending bill, right? So if you imagine that within like the current political climate, getting 2/3 of people in the House and in the Senate to vote on a bill, like almost nothing would get done, and that was the whole point of it. They wanted to keep the federal government small, and they didn't want there to be this huge kind of like spending spree and stuff, right? Which is what we've kind of seen in the modern era. So I'm not sure whether I support this or not support this because it's quite a radical change, and I think sometimes you do need to have like obviously some spending bills, and like all it would take is like say even 40% of people in one house decide no, I don't want to have this, then it just doesn't happen. And I think sometimes you do need to have that simple majority in both houses, and I think that this would just cause constant gridlock, right? So all the kind of good things that have been done in some of the other amendments, I think this would have helped keep the size of government small, but at the same time it would have also made it quite dysfunctional. Another change that they had to the Constitution was that rather than congressmen proposing constitutional amendments, it could only come from the state legislature. And that's obviously reflecting the nature of the Confederacy, because that was the whole kind of point of it, right? The whole point was that the different states, that's where power really rested. So they didn't want the federal government to be able to like pass lots of things, and so they wanted the states, yeah, to have the real like source of all power. Now that we've gone through the kind of good slash bad thing, depend on your like take, now we're going to get onto the really ugly stuff. And this is where it clearly states that the reason for Confederacy was to do with slavery. It's right there within the Constitution. So while the US Constitution talks about persons held to service or to labor, yeah, the Constitution of the Confederacy was explicitly talking about not just slavery, but Negro slavery, as it said. It talks about the institution of Negro slavery and how like the Confederacy is there to uphold this institution. So for people who kind of like dance around the fact of like, no, the South like kind of wanted to split away for tariffs or this or that, the main thing was slavery, right? You can't really argue with that. So all the people still peddling this kind of lost cause myth, just read your constitution of the country that you claim to love so much. Yeah, like read it. It's written there in black and white. So I don't want to have any more like debates about this. Check it for yourself. That's where it is. Right, so now that we've looked at the Constitution of the South and how it was different from the North Constitution, we also have to bear in mind that, you know, the South splitting away from the North would also have had later effects on different constitutional amendments. So we're not going to talk too much about like the future of the South and the future of the North. Like, you know, I mean, I can briefly talk about it just now. So for instance, obviously slavery is going to continue for a lot longer in this timeline. It probably will like kind of die out at some point in the 1880s, as happened in most places in the Americas, Brazil being the last one in 1888. And that was partly to do with like pressure from the British Empire, because the British Empire in the late 19th century was really staunchly anti-slavery, and so they put a lot of pressure on countries which they've been trading with to get rid of slavery. So yeah, the South, I think, as much as they would have wanted to hold on to that institution, they would have eventually had to have like freed it up. However, that's not to say that things would all been rosy. As obviously we saw within our own timeline, you had Jim Crow, which was, you know, a state of like apartheid basically, where like whites and blacks were kept separate, and that blacks were kept without any rights. Now, the lack of rights would have been even worse in this timeline because, you know, at least under the protection of the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments, blacks within the South at least had theoretical protection of like their rights as citizens. However, within the Confederacy, there would have been none of this at all. They would have freed the slaves and then kept a kind of like a system whereby slaves had no rights, you know, they couldn't vote, they couldn't do this, etc. So it would have been an even worse version of Jim Crow than we currently see in our own timeline. Probably something very similar to what we see in South Africa under apartheid. And as we saw in our own timeline, apartheid didn't end until 1944, and a big part of that was obviously pressure from America off the back of like, you know, the civil rights movement in the 60s, and then the amount of international pressure and condemnation. So I think that not only would apartheid have lasted longer in this timeline, but I think that racism within like the South, like the institution of Jim Crow, would have probably lasted into my lifetime at very least. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. And then obviously the movement of blacks out of the South wouldn't have been as like free in this time. They would have kind of been like refugees, right? Because what we have to think about when we talk about the Great Migration is that blacks, you know, like kind of were able to move freely across the whole of the United States and settle where they wanted. Yeah, so whether that's out west or whether that's in the northern cities, etc. But within this timeline, their movement would have been very much more restricted than in like the actual timeline. And on top of that, the North would have seen them as refugees, right? So in the same way you see like people on like the US American border, and you have border protection and stuff, you would have seen kind of the same thing there. Yes, you would have had some sympathetic people in the North, but a lot of people in the North, like, there were already race riots in the North, as it were, right, during the Civil War. So like people would not have wanted this flood of like former slaves coming to the North and settling. They would have seen as, well, like, you know, the South split away, that's their problem and stuff. Yeah, we don't want their problem to come seep across the border. And so I think that the northern states would have much smaller black population than is currently in our timeline. And I think that the South would still have a very, very large black population. But then on top of that, the South remaining within the United States, yeah, has had effect on constitutional amendments. And it's again to do with this fact of needing 3/4 of states to ratify things. And so now we're going to look at the US Constitution and the Southern Constitution and see what amendments would have passed and which ones wouldn't have. So first off, the 17th Amendment would never have passed in the Confederate States. And that's because several states never took action on the actual thing itself. So as you can see on the screen now, most of the states in the South did not vote this amendment. And this was the amendment which gave senators the right to be elected by the people, right? So before then, state legislatures, they picked who they would send to Washington, to represent their state in the Senate. So before then, the ordinary people within that state couldn't vote for who their senators were. So the 17th Amendment changed all that. However, in the South, this didn't really happen because the South was pretty much a one-party state, right? So every single one of the states were pretty much one-party states, and it's because the Democrat Party at that time was the party of white Southerners, right? And so as you can see, in a lot of these states, you're talking 90% of people voting for the Democrat Party at a time of election, and that's because the only people who are voting Republican in the South tend to be white liberals and the few black people who were able to pass the literacy test, etc., etc. And so as a result, the state legislatures, they liked this system where they could just pick someone, and because then they would just happen to pick the person who best represented the interests of maintaining white supremacy. And so it didn't really make much difference whether people could vote for the senator or not, because at the end of the day, if everyone's going to vote for that same way anyway, what difference does it make? So the 17th Amendment probably would not have been passed in the South. The next one is the 19th Amendment, right? So the 19th Amendment, that's the one that gives women suffrage. So what we kind of have forgotten in this modern era is that a lot of people, especially a lot of people in certain religious communities, were really against women voting, right? And this was particularly the case in the South. So the South wouldn't have ratified the 19th Amendment until 1970. And that's because, as you can see on screen here, this is the date in which the different states finally got round to ratifying these things, right? So Alabama, 1953, Florida, 1969, South Carolina, 1969, Georgia, 1970, Louisiana, 1970, North Carolina, 1971, and finally, Mississippi, 1984. 1984, Mississippi finally got round to ratifying the 19th Amendment, right? So yeah, it kind of speaks volume. It's not to say that a majority of people before that time wouldn't have supported it, but it kind of speaks to the fact of it took you that long to finally getting around to supporting the thing that said women have the right to vote. So yeah, that kind of that's quite significant, right? And so the North would have obviously passed this way before the South, and so the South in this time probably wouldn't have given women the right to vote probably until 1970 if we keep to the same timeline. So yes, so that would have, in the grand scheme of things, been very different for the South, but actually they still would have been 1 year ahead of Switzerland. So yeah, go Switzerland. The next amendment, which probably wouldn't have been passed in the South for quite some time, if at all, was the 21st Amendment, right? So this is the one that got rid of the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment was the one that implemented prohibition, so there was no alcohol being sold in America. Yeah, so the 21st one basically said that, hey, if states want to allow people to drink, they can. Yay! So it didn't force all states to change it and stuff. And this is why you had some places, even to this day, which are dry counties. So whole places where you can't actually buy or drink alcohol and stuff. And in previous decades, you had so-called dry states. So again with Mississippi didn't stop being a dry state until 1966. So yeah, so again, we can kind of see, again, this kind of pattern of places in the Deep South, which are obviously within the Bible Belt, being very hostile to anything that's kind of socially liberal or kind of progressive at all. So not saying that alcohol is good for people and stuff, but allowing people to have the freedom to drink alcohol is a relatively socially liberal thing. And then finally looking at two amendments which took place in the Civil Rights era, which the South voted against. That's the poll tax one, and that's the DC voting rights one. DC is predominantly black, and so people in the South were okay, up until this point, people in DC didn't have the right to vote for the presidency, and people in the South very much want to keep it that way because that would have been an extra set of votes, you know, like for like whichever president was going to be opposed to Jim Crow and stuff, right? And you also had the poll tax one, which was the 24th Amendment, and this basically allowed people to vote regardless of whether they paid the poll tax or not. So both poor whites and predominantly like blacks in the South were restricted from having the right to vote. And so while people in the North were very much in favour of that, in the South, that translated as votes that were obviously going to be against like Jim Crow laws and stuff. So they didn't want people to have the right to vote. And so many places in the South were very hostile to this amendment. And actually, in many places, it wasn't ratified until many, many decades later. And in some states, even today, it still hasn't been ratified. So, you know, time's ticking, people. Like, come on. Like, it's 2021. Like, speed up. So now we've looked at what constitutional amendments probably wouldn't have come to the South, if ever, like, or at very least, like, much, much later than happened in our own timeline. We're now going to look at the two amendments which would have passed the US Constitution had it not been for the Southern states. And that is the ERA, which was, you know, in the 1970s. And this just said that women had equal rights to men under the law. So that's all it said, right? It just said that women had equal protection under law. And yeah, so the fact that people in the South voted against that in many of the different states, yeah, that's why it didn't end up going on to the US Constitution. And then finally, in the 1930s, there was a rejected amendment for child labour. Yeah, child labour laws, right? So most places in the North were in favour of, you know, getting rid of child labour and like making that like illegal. And yeah, that didn't end up getting passed because of like Southern states holding it up. So yay, great progress, people, yeah. And so, you know, in many ways, like, you know, the Southern states being attached to the North had as much of an effect on the North as it would have had on the South. You know, so in our own timeline, you know, the United States have remained united in spite of that civil war, in spite of lots of different tensions, etc. But the society from North to South, especially in today's era, is very much like, you know, it doesn't really change so much. However, if the South had won the Civil War, and by win it we mean like there'd been no Civil War, then what we can see is that the North and the South would have evolved into completely different countries, right? And yeah, I think that in many regards this would have been a worse timeline. So as costly as the Civil War was, I think that, you know, there's a strong argument like for the South to, you know, have been crushed in that war and for slavery to have been abolished. However, it's something to note that the Southern states, from being more socially conservative, have often like kept like the more socially liberal states like kind of back in many ways. And yeah, so this is the whole argument about federalism versus confederalism. Yeah, this is the whole argument about states' rights versus like the supremacy of the federal government. Because as much as there's this kind of impetus to, you know, want to like impose things on certain states, there's also the opposite one which says let people like operate how they want to and let them like govern themselves. And this is the whole complexity with America, yeah, because they have all this. This debate is never really settled, yeah. There's this constant tension between the federal government and the state government, you know, and people in the comment section will like agree one way and disagree another. So yeah, so I don't know, let me know what you think in the comment section, yeah, about would this have been a better timeline? Would it have been a worse timeline? If so, why? And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope that it's given you a unique and original take. Like if you find a video which has done this before in this exact way, please let me know so I can find them. I'm joking, like but yeah, just like hopefully I've at least achieved some form of originality. And so the next video is going to be on what if America had a king, right? Which sounds, you know, sounds like I'm just pulling that out of my wazoo, but it actually came a lot closer to happening than we might think. So Alexander Hamilton suggested there be a president for life. And so basically what we're going to do with that timeline is we're going to run through all the different presidents from the past to the present, and we're going to imagine what would have happened if, instead of there being a hereditary monarchy, if instead each one had just passed from one president to the next. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting video. So definitely stay tuned for that. If if you haven't already, hit the like button, hit it now, hit it, and then subscribe, share with some friends, and also watch a lot more of our other videos as well. And yeah, with that being said, have a great day and bye.